You know, for almost half a century, there was this invisible line that just sliced right through Europe. It divided families, ideologies, and really the entire world. So today we're going to dig into how that line was drawn and the story of the two completely different worlds it created.
And it's a huge question, right? After the absolute worst war in human history, you'd think the world would be desperate for unity. But instead, we got a 45-year standoff, a war fought with ideas and economics and just plain fear instead of on battlefields. So let's start at the very beginning, with how a continent got split right in two. So once the dust from World War II settled, there were really only two major powers left standing, the United States and the Soviet Union. And the thing is, they had totally fundamentally different visions for how the world should work. Europe, well, it was about to become the main stage for their competition.
And that phrase, Iron Curtain, it wasn't just a clever metaphor. No, it was a very hard reality. On one side, you had nations lining up with the US, and on the other, you had countries that fell under the super tight grip of the Soviet Union. These weren't just political alliances, they were basically two different planets, completely sealed off from each other.
Okay, so let's look at the Western game plan first. The American strategy was pretty much twofold. First, create a massive military alliance for security, and second, build a connected economic system to make sure everyone was prosperous enough to avoid another war.
The absolute cornerstone of all of this was NATO, and this was a total game changer. The message to the Soviets was crystal clear. If you touch any one of our allies, you're picking a fight with the United States. That idea of collective defense, it drew a very real military line in the sand.
But look, military muscle wasn't the whole picture. The US knew that when people are economically desperate, that's when political chaos happens. That's what fueled World War II. So they set up these big institutions, the World Bank to help rebuild, the IMF to keep currencies stable, and GATT to tear down trade barriers. The goal? Create a rich, interconnected Western Europe that would be a walking advertisement for capitalism, and a strong wall against communism.
Of course, you can bet the Soviet Union was watching all of this and seeing it as a massive threat. So what did they do? They built their own mirror image set of institutions. But these weren't designed to connect with the world. They were designed to isolate their own chunk of it and tighten their control.
So, the Soviet answer to NATO was the Warsaw Pact. And yeah, on paper it looked like a similar military alliance, but its real job was to keep those Eastern European satellite states firmly under Moscow's military thumb.
And this right here, this gets to the absolute heart of the difference. NATO was all about protecting its members from an outside threat. The Warsaw Pact, it was for the USSR to control its members from the inside. A huge difference. And they did the exact same thing on the economic side with something called Comecon. Instead of free trade, it was a closed loop. Moscow was the one calling all the shots, deciding what each country would make, who they could sell it to, all of it designed to make sure all roads led right back to the Soviet Union.
Now, the whole idea behind this kind of centrally planned economy was total state control. The government owned everything, factories, farms, you name it, and in exchange, it provided social services. In theory, it was supposed to be a worker's paradise.
Yeah, that was the theory, but the reality almost never matched up. And when the state's rigid top-down ideology smashed up against basic human needs, well, the consequences were just devastating.
And this number, this just says it all. When Ukrainian farmers fought back against giving up their land for these new collective farms, the Soviet state didn't try to win them over. It created a famine. On purpose. A famine that killed millions. This wasn't just some economic screw-up. It was a weapon.
So you see the crucial point here, right? A system like this could only be held together by pure force. The economic and military control had to go hand in hand with just completely crushing individual freedoms and using brutal political control.
And nowhere was the failure of this system more on display than in Berlin. People were literally voting with their feet. They were escaping the poverty and oppression of East Berlin for the freedom and opportunity they saw in the West. For the Soviets, this was a PR nightmare.
And so, they built a wall. Just stop and think about that for a second. Most walls in history are built to keep invaders out. The Berlin Wall was built to lock its own people in. It became the most powerful and the ugliest symbol of the entire Cold War.
You know, for decades, this brutal system looked like it would last forever. It seemed unbreakable. But underneath that surface of total control, the hunger for freedom, for national identity, it was there. It was simmering, just waiting for a chance to finally boil over.
This timeline really tells the whole story, doesn't it? It's the story of brutal force, but also incredible hope.
The early attempts at freedom, in Hungary in '56, in Czechoslovakia in '68, they were just crushed by Soviet tanks. It seemed hopeless. But then, in 1985, a new kind of leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, came to power in Moscow, and his attempts to fix the system would accidentally end up lighting the fuse that blew the whole thing up.
This quote, this one statement, this was the kill switch for the entire Eastern Bloc. By announcing that the tanks were staying home, Gorbachev basically told the people of Eastern Europe, "You're on your own now." He took away the one thing that had held the empire together for 40 years, fear.
And once that fear was gone, the whole thing just crumbled like a house of cards. The broken, inefficient planned economies had totally failed to give people a decent life, and this powerful wave of nationalism swept through, with people demanding to have their own countries back. And within just 2 years, the Soviet Union itself was gone.
Which leaves us with this final, really important question. The Berlin Wall is a memory. The Warsaw Pact is history. But those deep lines, economic, political, cultural, that were carved across Europe during those 45 years, they didn't just vanish overnight. How much of today's global politics is still just an echo of that bipolar world? That's definitely something to think about.